Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming. We will start the presentation in about 4 minutes' time as we wait for other attendees to join us. To everyone that's joined in the last minute, thank you for coming. We will start at 6:35 p.m. Indian Standard Time. We are waiting for more attendees to join us. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We are going to be talking to you about household groups. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome to the CPHS webinar series. The CPHS webinar series is now a weekly series of events where we discuss either how we run the survey or we invite researchers from across the world who have done research using the survey to present their findings. Today, we'll be talking about household groups. Those of you who come to our events regularly know me. My name is Kaushik Krishnan. I work in the household survey division at CMIE, and it is my responsibility to make sure that the data from the Consumer Pyramids Household Survey is delivered to our subscribers and to researchers across the world. I'm usually joined by my senior colleague, Mr. Mahesh Vyas. Mahesh is the MD and CEO of CMIE. Mahesh is also the chief architect behind the Consumer Pyramids Household Survey. Mahesh is at another event today, and he's going to wrap that up and join us shortly. He'll hopefully be with us in about half an hour's time. I also have another colleague of mine today that's joining us, Siddhesh Satam. Siddhesh and I both work in the household survey division. As I present the presentation, Siddhesh will be answering questions as they show up in the Q&A box. So audience, please feel free to ask as many questions as you like. Siddhesh will be answering them as soon and as quickly as he can. Mahesh will join us, and once the presentation is over, which is expected to last about an hour, we will do live Q&A if there are any questions that remain unanswered. It's now 6:35 India time, so we'll begin. Siddhesh, could I ask you to unmute for just a minute and confirm whether you can see my screen?
Yes, I can see your screen.
Thank you, Siddhesh. And Siddhesh, can you still see it in full screen?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much. We'll begin. So thanks everybody for coming. Today, we're going to be talking to you about household groups in Consumer Pyramids Household Survey, or CPHS. This is becoming a fairly regular event, but I'm delighted to welcome new participants. I'm looking at the list of participants and there are several names here that I don't recognize. So we are really, really delighted to see new people joining us each time. For all of you who are joining us for the first time, let us tell you a little bit about CPHS. CPHS is an all-India household survey of a panel of sample households designed to capture fast frequency measures of well-being. When we say it is a fast frequency panel, we really mean it. We started CPHS in 2014 and we conduct 3 rounds of the survey every single year. We've managed to do that without a single break, which means that in 2021, sitting in October, we've already completed 23 rounds of data collection and we are in the midst of the 24th wave or the 24th round. Once this wave is complete, we would have completed 24 rounds of data collection and we look forward to even more rounds of data collection in the future. When we say a sample of households, many of you must be wondering, how large is that sample? The answer is that we have 178,677 households in the sample of CPHS. This makes us the largest regular household survey to be conducted in India. This also makes us the world's largest household panel survey to be conducted anywhere in the world. For those of you who are wondering what a panel survey is, most of you already know. A panel survey is just a survey where you interview the same households or the same people across time, depending on your survey unit. In our case, our sampling unit is the ultimate sampling unit is a household. So we interview the same households in every round or in every wave of data collection. When we say CPHS is an all India survey, we mean that CPHS truly covers the length and breadth of India. CPHS covers the landmass of India that accounts for 99% of India's population. We are truly in every part of India, almost every state, almost every district. There are a few exceptions. We are not, for example, in the islands like Lakshadweep Islands or the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. But in most cases, most districts, most states, we have a presence. We capture many, many measures of well-being. In the current version of CPHS, we capture 635 different indicators covering household well-being. In today's topic, I won't really go over these in any great detail, but if you are interested in this, please come to future talks. You can also find all of our past talks on our website as well as our YouTube channel. That will tell you a lot about the indicators that we cover in the dataset. And finally, we have had uninterrupted data collection in the last 18 months through the pandemic, through the lockdowns, etc. And it's perhaps for that reason that over 55 papers have already been written using CPHS in a very, very short period of time. I know I told you I wouldn't tell you a lot about our indicators. Here are some of the big themes in a nutshell. We cover areas as diverse as time use, health, education, income, consumption expenditure, assets, amenities, sentiment, etc. But I'd like to draw your attention to just one of these themes, which is household borrowing. And in particular, household borrowing has 2 components to it. We capture at the level of the household all the different loans or borrowings that a household has, and we know the source of that borrowing as well as the purpose of that borrowing. There can be many sources. For example, you can have a borrowing from a bank or a non-banking financial company or a microfinance institution, or even your relatives and friends. For each of these loans, we also know the purpose of the loan. You could, for example, have a loan from your family and friends for consumption expenditure, or a loan from a bank for a housing expenditure. All of this is captured in CPHS. But again, I'd like to focus on just one of these purposes and leave aside the sources completely. One purpose of borrowing in CPHS that we capture is borrowing only for the purpose of repaying some pre-existing debt. I talked about this in a webinar not too long ago, just a few weeks ago. And if you look at borrowing for the purpose of debt repayment and you plot the number of households or the fraction of households in India that have a debt only to repay an earlier debt, that number has risen quite dramatically. I covered this, as I said, in a previous talk, and at present, after the second round of lockdowns, it is the highest it's ever been at 5.3%. Now, we capture this information about loans and their purposes at the level of a household. So we know the household has a loan for the purpose of repaying another debt. Now, suppose we wanted to know more about this number that we see, that 5.3% of all households have a loan only for the purpose of repaying some other debt. And suppose we wanted to break this down by occupations. We wanted to see if households with salaried employees are different from households with, say, business families or households that engage in agriculture. Now, this is actually quite a hard thing to do, right? Because occupation is a characteristic about an individual, and there can be multiple individuals living inside a household. For example, you could have a household with 2 salaried employees and 1 person that runs a business. How would you categorize a household like that? Or in rural India, you might have a household where 1 person is doing agricultural work and the other person has a government job. How would you classify a household like that? It's not trivial. And so in CPHS, we have already created household groups that can help you as researchers move quickly with your research agenda. I'll give you an example of how powerful this is. If we take this number, 5.3% of all households in India have a debt for the purpose. We break this number down using our own household groups, where we've gone through the trouble of looking at all of the intricacies of different household compositions and assigned a household level characteristic, saying that this household is a business household or a salaried household or an agricultural household. What do you see? Well, first, let's start by showing you what happens to salaried households. As you can see, with salaried households, the story is quite muted, quite different from what you see in the aggregate. Both of these lockdowns don't seem to have had a big impact when it comes to salaried households taking on additional debt for the purpose of debt repayment. It's in the mid 3% range. In contrast, if you look at households that are classified as business in terms of their occupation, or households that are classified as farmers in terms of their occupation, you see a very different trend. You see for both of them, it's much higher, especially for the business households, as well as different trends when it comes to dips and troughs. So in the case of the farmer households, you see a dip as the lockdown was beginning, the first lockdown was beginning, and then a gradual rise. Whereas in the case of business households, you see no such dip. You see that the trend had started slightly even before the lockdowns had started, but got exacerbated due to lockdown conditions and also reached its peak earlier than when farmer households reached their peak. Now, all of this is possible because we have created household groups that make it easy to study households based on these very varying characteristics, right? So the message here is that salaried households were somehow safer, but I want to focus on how we created these groups, what groups exist and how they can help you with your research. So how can we produce a graph like this? Occupation, as I mentioned, is an individual level characteristic. People inside a household can have multiple occupations. So creating a household level occupation is not trivial. The easy solution, a solution that some may be tempted to use, is simply to use the head of household as a proxy for the household's occupation. But at CMIE, we feel we can do better than that. And how can we do better than that? That's through the creation of these household groups. And that's what we're going to talk to you about over the next 45 minutes. Broadly, we have 9 different household groups. We have age groups, occupation groups, power groups, gender groups, income groups, travel groups, education groups, water groups, household size groups, and that's it. Sorry for the small mistake in the animations there. As you can see, these household groups have different colors. Power, travel, size, and water are in one color. Occupation, age, gender, and education are in another color. And income is in a third color all of its own. I'll explain why this is. Things like a power group or a water group or a size group, those are actually household level characteristics. How much electricity does the household receive? How much water does the household receive? What is the size of the household? Those are relatively easy groups for us to create, but we'll walk you through them and we'll show you what they're like. Income is also a household level characteristic because we use household level income. But when we create income groups, we do some things that are important in smoothing out the data so that you can create these groups in a meaningful way. Then finally, we have groups like age groups, gender groups, education groups, and occupation groups. These groups are the hardest groups to create in a way because they depend firmly on individual level characteristics where we have to aggregate up these characteristics in a way that makes sense at the household level. So we'll start with the easiest groups first, like power, travel, size, and water, move to income, and then move to age, occupation, gender, and education. Let's start with size groups. Size groups are fairly simple and straightforward. This is just the number of members living inside the household. However, there are a couple of tricks. One, as those of you that have come to our other talks will know, we capture many different kinds of household members. In particular, even if a household member has left the household, we classify that person as an out migrant, but they persist in the data because we never know when that person will come back into the household. So even in something as trivial as computing household size, it's possible that a researcher might make a mistake or might not take into account a certain feature of the data set. So here we do it for you. We compute the number of live members, those members who are actually present within the household, and we turn that into a household group. We have 10 groups in total, 1 member, 2 members, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then beyond that, because there are not so many households that have such a large number of members, we have an 8 to 10 group, an 11 to 15 group, and then a greater than 15 group. You can always, of course, as a researcher, combine these groups. So suppose you only wanted to study households that were 4 members or smaller and 5 members and larger. You can simply combine the 1 member, 2 member, 3 member, and 4 member groups to form one group, and then the 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 11, 15, greater than 15 groups to form another group. You can do this with all of our household groups. They're always additive. And this also gives you a sense of what our sample is like. As you might imagine, 4-member households are the most common, followed by 3-member households and 5-member households on the other side. Taken together, they're almost 50% of the total sample. So these are our size groups, and these are ready indicators, ready variables in the data that you can use to quickly create crosstabs or summary statistics just for individual groups. This is the same story for all of our household groups. They're available to research do your analysis. Just like size groups, let us tell you a little bit about power groups. Power groups are based on information that we collect in CPHS about how much electricity different households receive. Some households may not be electrified, in which case their power group is not applicable. Other households may be electrified, but receive different levels of electricity depending on where they live and the civic amenities that they have access to. Some households might receive less than 6 hours of electricity. Other households might receive between 6 and 12 hours, 12 to 24 hours, and then many households might receive exactly 24 hours of electricity. So you can use that again in your analysis. Suppose you're interested in determining how air conditioner purchase or fridge purchase or different kinds of durable assets, which we track in the data, how purchase differs depending on access to electricity. You can do that taking advantage of our power groups. This shows you the distribution of households according to power groups in the sample. Please keep in mind, these are sample numbers, not population estimates. They show you the distribution of these different groups within the sample. So just like power groups, we also have water groups. In the case of water groups, it's the same idea that you can be not applicable, which means that you don't have a running water connection at home. You can receive less than 6 hours of water in a given day. You can receive between 6 and 12 hours, 12 and 24 hours, and then finally 24 hours of uninterrupted water access. As many of you might imagine, unlike with power, water is still something that's not necessarily available to everybody. You'll see that there's a higher number of people that don't have water connections and a much higher number of people that don't have access to 24-hour water supply. In particular, quite a few households that have less than 6 hours of water supply per day. Again, when it comes to important things like asset ownership, this can make a difference. This can also make a difference in terms of health and nutrition. If water availability isn't the same around the clock, perhaps that changes health outcomes. Equally, this might make a difference to all kinds of other household level outcomes. It could even make a difference to the way in which households spend money and earn money if, for example, they need to be home to make sure that they have enough water in the home, which might mean that they have fewer hours left in the day to be employed profitably for wages. These water groups, just like power groups, just like size groups, are available in the data set and can easily be used when you're trying to create summary statistics or even something a bit more complicated than that. Now, finally, we have something called travel groups. This is based off another very interesting indicator that we capture in the data, which is how much time does it take you on average as a household, as any member in the household, to travel a distance of 10 kilometers. Now, that is actually a measure of the kind of civic amenities you possess, whether you live in rural India, urban India, whether the roads are good, whether the public transport system is good, what mode of transport you have access to, etc. And so for some households, it might take less than 15 minutes for them to travel 10 kilometers. For other households, it might take them much more than even an hour. And so here again is the distribution that you can see. Now, keep in mind, this is from wave 23, the most recent wave, which is May to August of this year. Wave 23 has the dubious distinction of being a lockdown wave, like some of our other waves in recent times. And that's certainly changed the amount of time it would take for households to travel simply because there were restrictions on mobility, but at the same time also far less traffic on the streets in many parts of India. You see a huge mass of households where it takes between 50 to 30 minutes for them to travel a 10-kilometer distance, and then a somewhat smaller mass of households that take up to an hour to travel a distance of 10 kilometers. Again, when you're thinking about accessibility to hospitals, accessibility to other shops, accessibility to even workplaces, or thinking about how to compute labor market areas, these groups might be very interesting and useful groups for you to use in your analysis. They're available at your disposal and you don't have to compute them. The beauty is that they also change wave to wave. So as household responses change, they're put into the appropriate group, which means that you can perform analysis across time using these pre-computed variables via CPHS. Now that we've understood this most basic category of household groups, the groups that are based on household level characteristics where there's no complicated aggregation that's involved, let me tell you a little bit about income groups. Income groups, like I said, is based on household level income. But there are some challenges here in terms of creating income groups, and I'll walk you through this. Now, first and foremost, there are different approaches to creating something like an income group. One approach would be a purely statistical approach. You determine income groups on the basis of different quantiles. For example, you might say, let's use deciles or quintiles or different cuts of the data and categorize households depending on those cuts. Or you might say, rich households earn more than this much, poor households earn less than this much, and these are middle income households. Now, there are problems that we see in using this very statistical approach. It might work for certain kinds of research, but it might not be suitable for other kinds of research. For example, if you used quantile-based cutoffs, these cutoffs themselves would vary from wave to wave, making inter-wave comparisons quite difficult. Similarly, sometimes the cutoffs might not be intuitive. You might find that the 25th percentile of the income distribution is 3,485 rupees and 23 paise. And that's not a terribly intuitive cutoff to me, right? And so instead of following this approach, we offer a slightly different approach that might have its own pros, depending on what your research needs are. We create 25 cutoffs that are standard across time and make intuitive sense. Now, this is based on annual household income. When I say they're standard across time, it means that across time, no matter whether this is wave 1 of the data or wave 23 of the data, the cut points are the same. The second thing, intuitive sense, means that we aggregate up the incomes in a way that makes sense to somebody that's studying India. For example, if you earn 3,000 rupees or less monthly, that's quite a low income category, which means that in a year, you earn 36,000 rupees or less. That's one of our categories. Now, other categories take into account the fact that people are often paid in round numbers. So you won't find an annual income category of 34,256 rupees. And that when you multiply them by 12, they have some kind of meaningful cut points. And as you go up the income distribution, perhaps you need different cut points. So we cater for that over the 25 different cutoffs. We also summarize those cutoffs, just like with, say, size groups. So you can always mix and match these cutoff points or these groups to turn them from 25 groups into a far simpler number of groups. Now, in computing how a household fits into one of these groups, we slot households into a group based on the last 12 months of reported income as on the date that we survey them. Importantly, it is possible that monthly income is missing for a particular household for a particular month, or maybe 2 months, or even 3 months. In that case, we annualize the data so that households are comparable. So we solve the problem of missing data. What we do is we take the months in the last 12 months for which the household actually did report income data, we compute that average and multiply it up by 12 to give you an annualized figure. When doing this, we're careful not to override zeros. If a household says that they made 0 income in a month, we honor that. But if that data is truly missing, we then account for it through our annualization process. Let me show you what our groups look like. I won't show it to you at the 25 group level because that's a very difficult to read graph. But here it is in terms of somewhat broader categories. Households that make less than 100,000 rupees a year or 1 lakh a year. Households that make between 100,000 and 200,000 rupees a year. Households that make between 200 and 500,000 rupees a year. Households that make between 500,000 and a million rupees a year or 10 lakhs. And those households that make more than 10 lakh rupees a year. Now, this shape should not surprise anybody, right? Given what many people know in terms of stylistic facts about income in India, you would expect a certain bunching, and this is what we see. We see that there are a large mass of households that earn between 100,000 or 1 lakh and 500,000 or 5 lakh rupees, with households earning less as well as households earning more. Now, please, again, keep in mind, we are not presenting to you population estimates. We are not saying that this is the population estimate or distribution of income across households in India. We are characterizing our sample based on our own household groups. And this is what you would see if you used our income groups. The income groups in themselves exist for you to be able to make other comparisons. Suppose you're interested in studying educational outcomes differently depending on income groups. You can use these income groups immediately to create what might be interesting to you. Now, remember, we actually have 25 income groups. This is just an aggregation of those groups. So you can do fairly fine-grained analysis. You can use this even to study health. You could even use it to study consumption expenditure. If you want to know how households that earn over 10 lakh rupees purchase soap or other hygiene products, rupees, that's possible using these pre-computed income groups that we have to make it easier for research. Okay, now that we're done with income groups, we have 4 groups left: age, occupation, gender, and education. These are the ones that involve individual level characteristics and a certain kind of aggregation of those at the level of the household. They take a little bit more time to explain, but I'll go through each of them so that you can understand how we create these groups and hopefully either use them in your research or use the principles behind them in creating your own groups. Let's start with gender groups. Now, again, just like income, there can be different approaches to how you might create a gender group. One approach might be to simply use the head of the household and say that the gender of the head of the household is the gender of the household. That's one way you might want to do it. You might immediately see problems with it. One problem is you might be interested more in the distribution of gender rather than the gender of the head of the household. Let's take consumption expenditure again. Suppose you are interested in understanding consumption expenditure on categories like clothing and footwear, different kinds of hygiene or sanitary products, or medical expenditure, or even food-related expenditure. And you want to study those households that have a higher proportion of women differently from those households that have a higher proportion of men. Using the gender of the head of the household to stand in for that is quite problematic. It won't really help you in assessing what you're trying to assess. So instead, we offer a different approach using our knowledge of the data set, we use the full distribution of gender within the household to create a set of groups. One household group is called only male groups. That's quite simple. That's where there are 0 females according to CPHS in that household. Another household is a household called male-dominated households. Those are households where men outnumber women by over 2 times. So even if you multiply the number of women in the household by 2, there are still more men in that household, male-dominated households. Male-majority households are households that are less than male-dominated households, but where still men are more present than women in the household. Then you have gender-balanced households where men and women are equally present in the household, or I should say male and female, because they don't necessarily have to be above the age of 18. These are all the males and females present in the household, regardless of age. Female majority households are in the other direction, where there are more females than males, but it's not so many females that they outnumber males 2 to 1. Finally, female-dominated households, where females do outnumber males 2 to 1. And last is only female households, where there are no males at all in the household. Using these different gender groups, this is what the distribution is like. As you might expect, only male or only female households are quite rare. Again, the lion's share of households are those which are balanced, or those that have a majority male or a majority female, but aren't dominated by one or the other gender strongly. Again, this is nice because it shows you something with the balance of the sample, but I hope more importantly, it gives you an idea of how you can use our gender groups in studying other outcomes, other variables of interest in creating the cuts that you need. And that makes these groups quite powerful. Now, I have another group in the case of gender households, gender groups, and this is to show you how different it would be if you use the head of household approach as opposed to using our approach. So if you use the head of household approach, you would say that 86.7% of households are male households because they have a male head of household, and 13.3% of households are female households because they have a female head of household. Instead, if you use our approach, which is to use majority dominated, etc., using the full distribution of gender within the household, and if you classify female households as all households which are female majority, female dominated, or only female, and male households as all households which are male majority, male dominated, or only male, you will see the picture is quite different. It's much more balanced. There are still more male households than there are female households. But that skew that you see, because men are more likely to be the head of the household in India than women, disappears when you use our groups compared to using household groups. Now, after gender groups, I'd like to tell you a little bit about age groups. Now, age groups can be a little complicated because of the fact that there can be so many different households with so many different members of varying ages inside the household. So to understand it, we need to study some fictitious household distributions. So let's assume that there is a household, one household with an age distribution that looks like this. It's a very funny age distribution because it's bunched up at very young ages. In particular, if you drew a line at the age of 10, you would see in this fictitious distribution that 50% of the distribution is under 10 years old. 50% of all the members of the household are under the age of 10 years. Those are households that we would call children-dominant households. Equally, here's another fictitious age distribution for a household, but this is where 50% of the distribution of ages inside the household is for those people that are between the ages of 10 and 25. Okay, so not extremely young, but between the ages of 10 and 25. Those are households that we call youngster-dominant households. So first you saw children-dominated households. Now you're seeing youngster-dominated households. Similarly, you might have a household where it's not children-dominated or youngster-dominated, but together, including everybody all the way from age 0 up to age 25, they account for 50% of the age distribution or more. We call those other households of the young. Similarly, we can do this for households that have much more people that are older. So here's another example. These are cases where 50% of the distribution or more is over 25 years of age, but under 60 years of age. Those are households that we would call grown-up dominant because they're predominantly grown-ups in that household. Similarly, here's another fictitious distribution where over 50% of the distribution is people above the age of 60. Those are households that we will call senior dominant households. Okay, so let's recap. We have children-dominated households, youngster-dominated households. And then in some cases, neither children nor youngsters dominate, but together they dominate, which are households of the young. Similarly, you have grown-up dominated households for people between the ages of 25, or rather above 25 and below 60, as well as senior dominant households where they're 60 and above. So just like we had with households of the young, here we're going to have households of the old, where 50% of the distribution jointly is between people 26 years and older. These are called other households of grown-ups. So in total, we have very young households called children-dominated, then youngster-dominated households, then other households of the young. Then we have grown-up dominant households, senior dominant households, and other households of grown-ups, where it's not that the mass is only between 25 and 60 or only between 60 and above, but spread across 25 and above. That's other households of grown-ups. Now, to finish off the distribution, there are some cases that might be rare in the data that we need to account for. One is a bimodal distribution, where 50% of the distribution is less than 26 years of age, and 50% of the distribution is more than 26 years of age. This is one fictitious example. This is what we would call a balanced household that has seniors, where there are people above the age of 60. And then finally, another kind of bimodal distribution, but one where there are no seniors. It's still 50 and 50, but there's nobody above the age of 60 at all. So there's 50% of the household that's less than 26 years old and 50% of the household that's more than 26 years old. Now, this is another kind of balanced household, but we call this a balanced household with no seniors. Now, the reason we have these age groups is it's tremendously powerful when you're understanding household outcomes, especially around income and expenditure. If you want to understand how households with seniors have different expenditures, you can easily do that. But it's not just that they have seniors, but it's that seniors dominate the household, in which case they are also likely to dominate the expenditure of the household. Similarly, you might want to study income patterns in cases where most of the people living in the household are outside working age. Again, you can do that by looking at senior dominant households or grown-up dominant households or balanced households with seniors, depending on what your use case is, depending on what your research interests are. The same can be said for all the other indicators in our data. Suppose you're interested in investment patterns and you want to see how households with different age profiles are investing their money. You can do that easily using these age groups. So you might find that households that have younger people, but adults, grown-ups, are probably doing certain kinds of investments that might be a little riskier because they believe they can smooth out any risks that happen early in life. And in contrast, households that have a larger number of seniors might be investing or saving the money in safer products like fixed deposits or other things like that. All of this is possible, right? You can leverage all the 635 indicators that we give access to in CPHS by using these household groups. So they're really, really powerful. And I think age groups in particular are incredibly powerful. And as you will see on this slide, there's quite a good degree of variation. Grown-up households do dominate. They are the largest category. But you'll see that balanced households with no seniors are number 2, followed by other households of grown-ups, but tied with other households of the young. So there are lots of households with the young. In fact, there are youngster-dominated households that are even more, right? So you see this very interesting difference in the kind of age structure inside these households. And that can be exploited in learning a lot about different patterns in consumption, in income, in household characteristics, the way in which households save, in the way in which they borrow, in the way in which they spend their money, they invest their money, they decide to purchase assets, all of that. So this age group in particular, I think, and we all think at CMI is a very, very powerful tool. That's why we created these groups for researchers like the ones that are in the audience today to use when they conduct their research. Okay, we're mostly done. We only have a couple of groups left. One group in particular is education groups. And again, when you wonder how to count education, there are different ways to do it. The economists in our audience, I think, will be quite happy with the way in which we, in particular, count education. The big breakthrough, the big idea when it comes to education groups is something that many economists will already be familiar with, which is the idea that there are spillovers from education. Even if you have a household where most of the people have not even completed high school, but one person has a college education, that household is very, very, very different from a household where nobody's completed a college education at all, even though they might all have graduated high school, right? So there are spillovers that come from education. And so the person in the household that has the highest amount of education can often exert a spillover on the entire household in terms of the dynamics of that household. And even so, in other words, right, even one person having a certain level of education is quite important. We have three main broad groups. They get broken down, but three main broad groups. One is people who are graduates. Those are people that have completed collegiate education. Even if you have one college graduate, you become a household that's classified within the set of households that are called graduate households. Or you have somebody, even one person that's matriculated school. So even one person that's passed 10th standard is considered, as long as you have even one person in the household that's passed 10th standard, that household is considered a matriculated household. And then we have households that are less than matriculates. That's a household where there's nobody in the household who's even past 10th standard. And there can be different kinds of household groups that are less than matriculated. Okay, so these are the three broad groups: graduates, matriculates, and less than matriculates. Now, among them, we have many, many, many groups. And this is, again, what we'll show you with our education groups. As you can see, we have 4 different standalone groups. The first 4, AG, GD, G major, and G minor, those are all graduate household groups. The difference is how many people inside that household have a graduate degree. AG is all graduates, GD is graduate dominated, G major is graduates majority, and then G minor is graduates are a minority in the household. And that's possible because all you need is one graduate, college graduate in the household for you to be considered a graduate household. Then we have matriculate households, all matriculates, matriculates dominant, matriculates majority, and matriculates minority. Okay. Then you see this big mass of households. Those are all literate households, according to CPHS, where nobody has more than just literacy. They've not even passed 10th standard. But everybody in the household is literate. That constitutes a very large fraction of CPHS's total education groups. And then you have groups where only some people are literate or everybody's illiterate, and some groups which are not applicable. Those are groups where there are certain age cutoffs that are not met because we need people above a certain age to create these education groups. As you can see, these are incredibly powerful in their existence already, and they can be used in slicing and dicing the data in many different ways. Finally, after education groups have been done, just like we did with gender groups, let me show you how different a picture you will see if you use the head of the household's educational qualifications as a proxy for household education group instead of the entire distribution of household education characteristics. If you use the head of the household, 15.4% of all households, according to CPHS, in sample, have a head of the household that has graduated or more from college. On the other side, we have 54.6% of households where the head of the household has not completed 10th standard. In contrast, if you use our CMI groupings, which use the entire distribution of educational attainment, you see again that it's not as pronounced. 25% of households have at least one person that has a graduate degree, a college degree or more. And approximately 40% of households that don't have even one person who has completed 10th standard or who has matriculated. And these differences are very interesting and noteworthy distinctions to make. This is why our household groups are so powerful. Now, I think we've gone through almost all of the groups. We have only one group left. That's the occupation group. Now, this is an incredibly powerful group. It's also the group that I started today's talk with as a motivation to show you how occupation groups are different. And this is a group that requires a lot of work on our part in creating it. So when you have two approaches. You can use the head of the household, or you can use our approach. If you use the head of household approach, we determine household occupation on the basis of the head of the household. That would be the head of household approach. There are obvious problems with that. The most common problem is that the occupation of the head of household need not at all even be the dominant occupation of the household. It could be that the head of the household runs a small business and everybody else in the household does some kind of agricultural work or farming work. In which case, it may not be appropriate to classify that household as a business household. It might be far more appropriate to classify that household as an agricultural or a farming household. For example, here's a very, very useful example. 18% of all of heads of households are retired. So it would be a very, very bad idea, depending on your application, to simply say that all of these 18% of households in the sample are retired households, right? Instead, you would want to use the dominant occupation of the working members of the household. So our approach is to make a primary classification, which is based on the following groups and which of these groups has the majority of workers. So here are the groups: business, salaried, farmer, small traders and daily wage, retired or aged, and others. And then finally, within these groups, if a majority of the householders are in business-related occupations, the household is called a business household. Alternatively, if the majority of householders are in small traders or daily wage occupation, they are classified as group number 4, small traders and daily wage. If there's a tie between two groups, suppose that there's an equal number of people in the household that are small traders and daily wage and also business, then this classification that we have, this ordered classification of 1 through 6, is also the order of precedence. In which case, if there's a tie between, say, 1 and 4, 1 takes precedence. The reason for this is that there's an intuitive sense in this ordering. If a household has the same number of people in business as well as in farming communities, we feel that a business classification makes more sense compared to farming. But if between farming and small trading and daily wage, there's an equal number of people, we feel that farming should have precedence. Now, this is our intuitive sense based on how we understand occupations in India. You don't have to follow this, but it's available for you to follow. And it's very easy for you to implement, because otherwise you have to take account of all kinds of different household occupational structures. Now, these are only the primary classifications. Just like with income groups, where we have 25 different income groups, we have 25, in fact, we have more than 25 occupation groups. And once we put you within a certain group, suppose you're in the business group, within the business group, we have different subgroups. And we follow the same tiered approach in putting you into one of those subgroups. There's a set of groups or subgroups within business. The majority of householders will determine which of those groups you fall into. If there's a tie, again, the tie is resolved on the basis of that ordering. That entire ordering is there in our documentation, and you can see how we resolve ties through this process. Now, this, in a nutshell, is how we do it. It's a very complicated process, but at its heart, it's very elegant and simple. It takes advantage of the fact that we know the complete distribution of occupational attainment within the household, and using that can help you paint a much richer picture than simply using the head of household's occupation. As you can see, 18% of all heads of households are retired. So if you were to simply use the head of household's occupation, you would often go wrong. You would classify households very differently from their true occupational characteristics. Now, let me show you what the outcome of all of that is. These are the 6 big groups that we have in the data: business, salaried, small traders and wage laborers, farmers, retired, and others. And as you can see, there's quite a smattering, quite a grouping across households. So you still have households that will be classified as retired, where the majority of the people are retired. That's about 27,000 out of the 178,000 households in the data. But if you simply use head of household, that will be a very different number. Business households are the most common kinds of households that you see, followed by salaried households, followed by small traders and wage laborers, followed by farmers. Why is this the case? Keep in mind, this is the case because these are all in-sample numbers, not population estimates. Our sample is different between rural and urban areas. This is something we talk about in great detail when we talk about our sampling and survey design. Approximately, there are 2 urban households sampled for every rural household. When you create population estimates, this is going to look very different. But this is just to give you a sense of what the sample looks like. And within the sample, what the spread of occupational groups is. So we've taken you through all of the 9 household groups: power, travel, size, and water. Those are, in a way, the easiest groups to create. Income groups, where we do work in annualizing and treating zero incomes in a particular way, and also the timing of when to take that income. And then these 4 individual specific characteristics that get agglomerated into household groups: age, gender, education, and occupation. Together, these 9 groups are very powerful. The big takeaway here is you could use head of household as a proxy, but you could do something much more sophisticated, which is the approach that we take. And in doing so, you do a much better job of collapsing the entire distribution of age or gender or education or occupation within a household into one variable to stand in place of that household. As we show you in comparisons between head of household approaches and CMI approaches are very different from the head of household approach. So it depends on what your use case is as a researcher in terms of what you'd like to choose. And finally, as I showed you in the very first slide, when you look at an aggregate statistic like how many households in India have a loan or a borrowing for the purpose of repaying another debt, that's 5.3%, and that's a population estimate, not just in sample. That story is very different when you look at salaried households that only have about 3 or 3.5% of all salaried households that have a borrowing for the purpose of debt repayment, and business households that have 7% or higher, or rather the other way around, 7% or more of all business households in India have a debt only for the purpose of repaying another debt. So you can see the differences in those outcomes, and it will be very easy for you to do as a researcher. You would simply have to use our occupation groups, and then you can run with that without having to do a lot of extra processing work or pre-processing work just to compute a graph like this. So we hope we've been able to motivate to you the reason behind our household groupings, the power that it gives you as researchers, why we choose our approach instead of just using the head of the household. And in doing so, we hope that this is something that's useful to all of you as researchers and something that you'll use. Thank you so much for your time. My name is Kaushik Krishnan. This is my email address. Mahesh, who's usually at these discussions, and I think would have probably joined the discussion by now. Mahesh is the MD and CEO of the company. That's his email address on the left-hand side. Mahesh is also the chief architect of CPHS, so the best person to answer questions. Today, we had a third colleague joining us, Siddhesh Satam. Siddhesh has answered questions patiently that have come up in the Q&A box. I'm going to stop presenting now and hand it over to Mahesh. Hi, Mahesh. Nice to see you. I'm not sure when you came in, but you've been seeing the questions coming in the chat box. So any thoughts that you would like to discuss, any questions that you thought you'd like to answer at the end of the discussion?
No, I'm sorry I could not attend the whole session today. I came just about 5 or 7 minutes ago, and there are no questions outstanding in the Q&A box at the moment. But I think this was a very important presentation. Most people so far have struggled. How do you deal with a household? How do you classify a household to be a farmer's household or the household of a salaried employee if both coexist in the same household, for example? Or it could be a business person's household combined with somebody else who's a salaried person. I think what we have done at CMI is very valuable in developing algorithms by which rules by which households can be objectively classified one way or the other. And I think that is very important. It solves a big problem for people when they have to take shortcuts like just use the head of the household, a concept which is so old fashioned, head of the household, as if there is one head of the household. It's not the case in my household, at least, and not in many modern households today. So I think we should get rid of this concept called head of household, except for there being one as a reference point for all of the relationships in the household. So this classification is tremendously helpful and useful to all researchers. Your talk will go a long way in helping them to understand this. And if there are any questions, we'll answer. There's one that has come up. I want to know the difference between dominated and majority household. Nice one. So maybe I can take that.
Please, Mahesh.
So majority is very simple. If suppose you're looking at graduates, so households which are majority graduates, that means that more than 50% of the members of the household are graduate. But what if, let us say, more than 75% of the members of the household are graduate? Then it is dominated by graduates. So the cutoff is 75%. If more than 75% of the members of the household are graduates, it's not enough to say this is majority. So we go even further to say dominated by them. I hope that answers the question adequately. It's a straightforward question with a straightforward answer.
Yeah, thanks, Mesh. And you're right. We use this dominated versus majority with gender. We use it with education, and it's very powerful because a household that has, and even age, a household that's dominated by seniors is going to have a very different expenditure pattern, a very different investment pattern, asset accumulation pattern compared to a household that might have even a majority of seniors. Right? And so these, even though there might not be very many of them, as a percentage in the total sample, because the sample is so large, as an absolute number, you'll still find them in the thousands, which is certainly enough to distinguish differences in patterns across those groups. So thanks for answering that. And as you said, I don't think I could have said it better or anybody else could have said it better, so I won't try. But there's a lot of power in these household groups. And we hope that we start to see research where researchers use these groups themselves. It will save them a lot of trouble, will make it faster for them to be able to do research and turn around results. Mahesh, we seem to have lost your video, but thanks for coming in. I don't see any more questions, so I will bring today's proceedings to a close. Mahesh, would you like to say any last words if you're still here? I'm not sure if we've lost you. I think we may have lost Mahesh. Siddhesh, can you hear me?
Sorry, I'm here. I had a problem.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Sorry, Mahesh. I was just wrapping up and thanking the audience for coming. A lot of new faces, new people coming to our events. So it's always nice to see this happening. There's one last question regarding water supply. Mahesh, would you like to answer this? This is not about a household groups, but might still be an interesting question to answer.
Regarding water supply based on municipality supply or water tanks inside bathrooms are included. Yes, water tanks inside bathrooms are also included. So it could be a municipal connection. It could be a water tank which has some piped water coming in. What's important is that you require to have water supply inside the household. We don't exclude households that don't necessarily have a municipal connection. If you have a connection from a local tank, that's okay. That's good enough.
Thanks, Mahesh. I'm just typing that out as an answer so that it goes into our Q&A. Okay, great. I think those are all the questions. Unless anybody in the audience has any final questions that you'd like to ask us, I'll bring today's session to a close. Now that we're on a weekly frequency, we get to interact with you much more. You have much more opportunities to ask us questions. So we hope you'll join us next week as well. We're going to be talking about age and gender. That's going to be really, really exciting. It's brand new documentation, and there's a lot to cover and a lot to learn about India just by understanding the changes to India's age and gender pyramids over time. And please, those of you that don't yet know, mark your calendars for the last Thursday of this month. Ashwini Deshpande, who is a professor at Ashoka University and who kicked off our research seminar series last year in October, is joining us again to celebrate 1 year of the research seminar series. This is joint work with a PhD student of hers, Jitendra Singh, and it is on female labor force participation in India, which is a hot topic for labor economists studying India. And it will be discussed by Professor Marianne Bertrand, who has done a lot of work on the subject of female labor force participation and the norms, the cultural norms surrounding female labor force participation. Marianne is a professor at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. It's going to be a great, great talk. So we really hope you will all join us. All our events are open to the public. Please, if you like this event, please tweet about it. Please share the link with your friends, your colleagues. All our events can be signed up through our website, which is consumerpyramidsdx.cmi.com. Just click on the webinars tab. If any of you are itching to use the data but don't yet have access or don't know if you have access, you can go to our website and just click on request subscription, and you will immediately be put in touch with one of us here at CMI, and we'll get in touch with you. If your institution already has access, we'll tell you how you can do that. If not, we'll be happy to enable access wherever it is across the world that you are. So thank you everyone for attending. Thank you Mahesh and Siddhesh for both attending today. I'll bring today's proceedings to a close.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.